Book 2, Chapter 1. Whether the empire acquired by the Romans was more due to valor or to fortune. Many authors, and among others that most grave historian Plutarch, have thought that in acquiring their empire, the Romans were more beholden to their good fortune than to their valor. And besides other reasons which they give for this opinion, they affirm it to be proved by the admission of the Romans themselves, since their having erected more temples to fortune than to any other deity shows that it was to her that they ascribed their success. It would seem, too, that Titus Livius was of the same mind, since he very seldom puts a speech into the mouth of any Roman in which he discourses of valor, wherein he does not also make mention of fortune. This, however, is an opinion with which I can in no way concur, and which, I take it, cannot be made good. For if no commonwealth has ever been found to grow like the Roman, it is because none was ever found so well fitted by its institutions to make that growth. For by the valor of her army she spread her empire, while by her conduct of affairs, and by other methods peculiar to herself, and devised by her first founder, she was able to keep what she acquired, as shall be fully shown in many of the following discourses. The writers to whom I have referred assert that it was owing to their good fortune, and not to their prudence, that the Romans never had two great wars on their hands at once, as, for instance, that they waged no wars with the Latins until they had not merely overcome the Samnites, but undertook in their defense the war on which they then entered, nor ever fought with the Etruscans until they had subjugated the Latins and had almost worn out the Samnites by frequent defeats. Whereas, had any two of these powers, while yet fresh and unexhausted, united together, it may easily be believed that the ruin of the Roman Republic must have followed. But to whatsoever cause we ascribe it, it never so chanced that the Romans engaged in two great wars at the same time. On the contrary, it always seemed as though on the breaking out of one war, another was extinguished, or that on the termination of one, another broke out. And this we may plainly see from the order in which their wars succeeded one another. For, omitting those waged by them before their city was taken by the Gauls, we find that during their struggle with the Equians and the Volscians, and while these two nations continued strong, no others rose against them. On these being subdued, there broke out the war with the Samnites, and although before the close of that contest, the Latin nations had begun to rebel against Rome, nevertheless, when their rebellion came to a head, the Samnites were in league with Rome, and helped her with their army to quell the presumption of the rebels, on whose defeat the war with Samnium was renewed. When the strength of Samnium had been drained by repeated reverses, there followed the war with the Etruscans, which ended, the Samnites were once more stirred to activity by the coming of Pyrrhus into Italy. When he too had been defeated and sent back to Greece, Rome entered on her first war with the Carthaginians, which was no sooner over than all the Gallic nations on both sides of the Alps combined against the Romans, by whom, in the battle fought between Populonia and Pisa, where now stands the fortress of San Vincenzo, they were at last routed with tremendous slaughter. This war ended. For 20 years together, the Romans were engaged in no contest of importance, their only adversaries being the Ligurians and the remnant of the Gallic tribes who occupied Lombardy. And on this footing things continued down to the Second Carthaginian War, which for 16 years kept the whole of Italy in a blaze. This too being brought to a most glorious termination, there followed the Macedonian War, at the close of which succeeded the war with Antiochus and Asia. These subdued, there remained not in the whole world king or people who either singly or together could withstand the power of Rome. But even before this last victory, anyone observing the order of these wars and the method in which they were conducted must have recognized not only the good fortune of the Romans, but also their extraordinary valor and prudence. And were anyone to search for the causes of this good fortune, he would have little difficulty in finding them, since nothing is more certain than that when a potentate has attained so great a reputation that every neighboring prince or people is afraid to engage him single-handed, and stands in awe of him, none will ever venture to attack him, unless driven to do so by necessity, so that it will almost rest on his will to make war as he likes on any of his neighbors, while he studiously maintains peace with the rest, who, on their part, whether through fear of his power or deceived by the methods he takes to lull their vigilance, are easily kept quiet. Distant powers, in the meantime, who have no intercourse with either, treat the matter as too remote to concern them in any way, and abiding in this air until the conflagration approaches their own doors, on its arrival, have no resource for its extinction, save in their own strength, which, as their enemy has by that time become exceedingly powerful, no longer suffices. I forbear to relate how the Samnites stood looking on while the Romans were subjugating the Aequians and the Volscians, and to avoid being prolix, shall content myself with a single instance of the Carthaginians, who, at the time when the Romans were contending with the Samnites and Etruscans, were possessed of great power and held in high repute, being already masters of the whole of Africa, together with Sicily and Sardinia, besides occupying territory in various parts of Spain. And because their empire was so great, and at such a distance from the Roman frontier, they were never led to think of attacking the Romans, or of lending assistance to the Etruscans or Samnites. On the contrary, they behaved towards the Romans as men behave towards those whom they see prosper, rather taking their part and courting their friendship. Nor did they discover their mistake until the Romans, after subduing all the intervening nations, began to assail their power both in Spain and Sicily. What happened in the case of the Carthaginians happened also in the case of the Gauls, of Philip of Macedon, and of Antiochus, each of whom, while Rome was engaged with another of them, believed that other would have the advantage, and that there would be time enough to provide for their own safety, whether by making peace or war. It seems to me, therefore, that the same good fortune which, in this respect, attended the Romans, might be shared by all princes acting as they did, and of a valor equal to theirs. As bearing on this point, it might have been proper for me to show what methods were followed by the Romans in entering the territories of other nations, had I not already spoken of this at length in my treatise on princedoms, wherein the whole subject is discussed. Here it is enough to say briefly, that in a new province they always sought for some friend who should be to them as a ladder whereby to climb, a door through which to pass, or an instrument wherewith to keep their hold. Thus we see them effect their entrance into Samnium through the Capuans, into Etruria through the Camertines, into Sicily through the Mamertines, into Spain through the Saguntines, into Africa through Massinissa, into Greece through the Aetolians, into Asia through Eumenes and other princes, into Gaul through the Massilians and Aeduans, and, in like manner, never without similar assistance in their efforts whether to acquire provinces or to keep them. The nations who carefully attend to this precaution will be seen to stand in less need of fortune's help than others who neglect it. But that all may clearly understand how much more the Romans were aided by valor than by fortune in acquiring their empire, I shall, in the following chapter, consider the character of those nations with whom they had to contend, and show how stubborn these were in defending their freedom.